normally when we have Poetry East, we ask the poet that we're invited to suggest 2 poems. And Jorie wanted to read the poems herself, so she's going to read 2 Autumn to us, and we'll start off with that.
Well, you won't hear another poem that's good this evening, so you might as well enjoy this one. So Keats is writing this poem in his early 20s, about 2 years before he dies. He knows he has consumption. He feels it in his body. It's obviously, he feels it inside him in his chest, and he's seen his family members die of it. And he knows what's coming, and this is just a great poem, and the final poem he wrote that was really a significant poem before he just tried to survive till the end. And it's such a beautiful poem, but what I would like to ask you the first time that we go through it to listen for is what your body is being asked to do by, especially the first and the third stanza, what you're asked to see, what you're asked to smell, what you're asked to hear, what you imagine you could touch. Partly because, I'll talk about it a bit later, but one of the things that interests me about this poem, and that's always been very important to me about it, is that he's trying to arrive at certain emotions which you can imagine he would need to arrive at the stage in life that he was finding himself in. And he needed poetry and the techne of poetry, the activities of music, image, imagination, syntax, most importantly the sensorium, the body, his senses, to bring him to emotions that he needed to arrive at in order to achieve his life, in order to be able to face his death and be able to let go in a way that involved, as he himself described life, in something that would achieve the veil of soul-making, this final acceptance without fury or rage or just simply terror. So one of the things about the poem is all the things that I've asked you to do are things that he himself had to do to write the poem, and he writes the poem in order to arrive at an emotional state that he can't get to except by writing the poem. And I think that that's one of the great things about poetry when you're confronted by real poems, is this feeling of the poem needed to be written in order for the poet to arrive at emotions, sensations, emotions, and then eventually, very late in the game, perhaps ideas, that they couldn't have arrived at except by crossing through the activity of sensing, imagining, describing, and eventually thinking. So that's very important, I think, for the practice that we're engaged in here. That sometimes you have to go through the world, and the everyday world is there for you. You have to go through it, and poetry can take you through it. A simple thing as the act of description can take you through it in order for you to change the course of what you feel, because the attempt to enter and participate in something as simple as the season, autumn, that he's writing about. Obviously, that's the season he would be writing about in what we call the autumn of his life. In order for it to give him a wisdom and a sensation that he couldn't get by other means. Season to autumn, it's addressed to autumn. Peter and I were arguing about whether autumn in the second stanza is personified as male or female. He insists that it's female. I had always seen it as a little bit more gender neutral. So in this day and age, you can make that anything you want. To autumn. His other great odes are, say ode to. This one doesn't say, it just takes away the word ode altogether. It is an ode, but it's interesting to me that he just says to autumn. If you're ever in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you can go into the Houghton Library and see his draft of this poem, which is very moving to see. You also can see his copy of Shakespeare, where he has a lot of commentary in the margins of the plays, including suggested revisions. This was not a young poet who didn't know how great he was. But he had been assaulted by his many of the poets and the critics of his moment. He didn't come from a class of people that it was expected poetry would come from, and many people feel that the final assaults on his work weakened his immune system to the point where, Shelley and others felt that he was killed by the critics, so you can enjoy that part of it too. I can identify with that one, really. To autumn. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. Close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease. For summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twined flowers. And sometimes like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press with patient look thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them. Thou hast thou music too. While barred clouds bloom the soft dying day and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue, then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. And full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly morn. Hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. So, every one of us is being filled with ripeness to the core. That's the function of existence. To look at these verbs, to load and bless and bend and fill with ripeness and swell and plump and set budding more and still more later flowers until they think this is violent. Life is very violent. It's asking you to live. So to the core. And that's all about, expanding, having experience, aging, filling, plumping. Some of us plump a bit more. But this word more, it has its, if you resist it, it's going to get you anyway. So you might as well undergo it. And if you embrace it too much and you become the engine of the more, as opposed to letting the season do its work on you, the world do its work on you, then you're just in the throes of desire. And chances are artificial desire for more. That's a different more. So obviously there's a moment in which in every life we turn and we say, but where's who I was? Where are the songs of spring? Where are they? There's grief every day for the day before. Everyone in this room who has bad knees for when they had good knees. Okay? Everyone in this room for when they had love which has gone awry, or when they had work which has been taken, or when they had a sense of purpose and hope and existence which living in today's world probably decimates, or when we lived with a kind of innocence and without fear that the people who are in charge of this mess, the 0.01%, are out for themselves and have no care for us or any other species or anything alive besides themselves on this planet. Extinction rates, I read a headline saying that giraffe silently slips onto the endangered list. I thought, silently slips onto the endangered list. We don't even want to know. So, nostalgia, do we have grief for the days in which, these creatures, these seasons, were not in the hands of greed and, exploitation by multinational corporations? Yes. Advanced capitalism is a disaster, but at the same time, there is the season here. Look at these blossoms outside. As we were thinking load and bless, and I looked at the cherry tree across the street, and I thought, oh my God, look at that. And my husband said, look, the blossoms are already being replaced by leaves. And I thought, oh, there it is, okay, already being replaced by, where was that key moment when we were each the cherry tree just at the moment of bloom, but not yet at the moment of the loss of bloom. So that's a complicated emotion to have. And in this poem, it's solved by many different strategies. When he tries to get himself to feel that it's okay to let go of that grief, he turns to the clouds blooming in the soft dying day and watches them touch the stubble plains. Obviously, the harvest has occurred. It's stubble. But, of course, there's a richness in having the harvest brought in. Then he listens to the small gnats and listens to it. They're borne aloft, and he hears the wind, the light wind, live and die, carrying gnats. So if you start making the sounds that he wants you to hear, that he's hearing, you can make the small gnats mourn, and that's just like a really high-pitched hum. After all the incredible weight and ooze and filling and enriching of the flesh of that first stanza, of everything going into the full richness of its maturity, there's then this sort of spirit which is a release from it, and you go into the sounds that are perhaps certainly rising up towards the skies, but the light wind lives and dies. Might as well take a lesson from the light wind. The light sinks as it must and will rise again. The full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly morn. They're far away, so you have to put the sound of the gnats, and then you have to put the sound of the full-grown lambs, but they're lambs. Okay? They're little, so the sounds are kind of far away, but many, multiple. And then all of a sudden hedge crickets sing, and it starts to fill with an orchestral quality in which it's sort of instructing you that you can enter into it if you wish to. And now with treble soft, at that point he's actually telling you that he is making a musical composition. The red breast, this is the soloist now. Always in Keats identifies with some bird, obviously. Not a nightingale in this case, it's the only single thing singing. So we might think of the poet as a kind of bird. the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and then of course it being autumn, the swallows are gathering, and they're twittering in the sky. So if you go from the gnats to the wind and the bleating lambs and the hedge crickets, that little sound, singing, and the single redbreast, and then the twittering. Imagine the sound that you have that's in the skies rising up with you, where hopefully the soul and the emotions can go, as opposed to feeling the incredible ripening to the core that life is asking of you. Once you've been ripened to the core, you lift up into the skies in this unbelievable music. So I just think these are emotions that he needed to have, and he had to rely on the things that I was just describing of his to have these emotions. The emotion of the swallows is not the emotion of the hedge crickets, right? And the emotion of the lambs is not the emotion of the gnats, mourning. So he moves from mourning to living and dying to bleeding, and then singing, and then treble soft whistling, and then the skies. So he's moved through these different sounds to a kind of set of ever higher, clearer, sharper, and more departing emotions to allow himself to feel them. So poetry, isn't about he has these emotions over here and then he uses these things to describe them over here. He actually goes to them for the sensory data that will rise up through his senses into his emotive instrument, so he can feel it. And as a result of feeling it, he can transmit it. Granted, he's somewhat talented at transmitting it.
That's really wonderful. Thank you very much, Jorie. I mean, there's a wonderful kind of. I'd love you to do more, but I'd like to come to you as well. But
let's stick with Keats.
So I was trying to think where we might we start, and I sort of thought we might start with your grandparents. I don't know why. I was reading that wonderful poem from the New World, which is an incredible mixture of history and your own grandparents and that silver clasp. I thought we might start perhaps with that silver clasp and with your grandparents, and then take us from there.
In that poem, my grandparents were together all their lives, first generation American Jews. In that poem, is that the poem with Ivan?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. It's been a while. In that poem, one of the things that I was doing was juxtaposing different images in order to be able to figure out how to feel about the scale of, how to put into relation scales of emotional reactions to things in life that I still think I'm working on. For example, the death, seeing your grandmother and grandfather put into different old age homes because there wasn't any home that would take both of them. The dementia of my grandmother, etc., and that grief. The small detail is that she would sit on the bed with a clasp in her purse that she would open and shut, saying that she was ready to go home now, every day. Obviously, that's a grief that we know the dimensions of. In that poem, there's a trial going on in Israel of a man who was one of the guards in the concentration camps, and it was televised, and he was an auto worker in Cleveland who had been found and brought to trial, and he had done horrific things during the Holocaust. In particular, a child who survived one of the gas chambers and came out asking for her mother was made to go back in after more violent things were done to her before she was finally killed. But the narrative involved her saying please when she came out. And this word, this simple word, please, the civil, this word that comes out of a civilizational impulse. You say please to somebody else because you give them room to hear you and to have their own thought and to respond. It's a courtesy in every language for a reason. There's really no reason to say please. It's not really begging. It's a making room for the other person's soul within the reaches of your own soul, so that a child coming out of a gas chamber, having watched everybody die and having survived accidentally, asking please for her mother, was a detail that came up in the trial. So I tried to put my grandmother's grief and then the grief of the Holocaust into the same. How do you weigh these things against each other? How does your soul hold them differently? There's a moment in the poem in which I go into, I lock myself in the bathroom and look in the mirror because I can't figure out what to do with the differences in the scale of these events. I have this vision, which actually happened. I mean, I had this feeling of all the living and all the dead suddenly, like as if they were flowing through all of us all the time. And people often think that, because I say the billions, and people often correct me and say, it was only millions that were killed during the Holocaust. So I have to know I don't mean billions of European Jews and others in the camps. I mean the billions of humans, of souls that are transmitted back through. But I think that this idea of what's commensurate, what's like what you allow to put within the same range of emotion. People often get mad at me about my poems because I will try to put the death of a beloved dog and an event that's an atrocity on a genocidal scale into the same poem, because I think that part of what makes us insane is that our personal grief and our societal grief and our communal grief and our grief as a nation state and our grief as a species and our grief as a parent of a small child or of a dying parent, how are we supposed to organize these and hold them within our soul at once, and not and certainly are we really supposed to compartmentalize them? Is that where did that rule come from? The rule that you can't have it is. So I think at this point we are probably in a moment in history where our own death, the death of loved ones, is up against, which we should be able to feel, especially our relationship to our own death, which is a crucial spiritual activity, and one wants to be in relation to it as one lives, and one wants to be aware that one is living as a mortal creature and therefore is up against one's own end. And that's usually been a precious spiritual freedom and obligation and practice, right? That's what most religions are for, is trying to figure out, others are and I am mortal, so how do we deal with this? But then you have, the extinction of species, the death of oceans, the possible destruction of the planet, the genocide, 74 million people migrating across the planet just looking for a place where they can be at home and not be killed. So you try to hold these, the Darfur massacre. I mean, you try to hold these things in mind, and you sort of feel like, well, the death of my father, where does that fit into, the extinction of the last white rhino? The last, that photograph of the man photographing the last white rhino. The last. What does extinction mean? The last. What does that mean? And my father isn't the last human. So can I grieve my father the way I have to, So that sense of what is probably making us all crazy, which is that things are not equal and yet they're all happening in the same space for us, is a very hard thing for the human soul to carry. And I think that poetry allows you to make them adjacent in a way that compels you to figure out your own solution to how these emotional weights can be carried. You certainly can't block any of it out, so you have to, and the technology doesn't help at all because it equalizes it all. Everything is breaking news, okay? Good morning, it's breaking news. The sun came up, 7,000 more infants and adults died crossing the Mediterranean, trying to get away from a Holocaust in Syria. Breaking news. And like, where do you... So this is the first poem that I wrote of a long series in which this sense of how do you put the personal and the political and the transpersonal and the societal and the ecological and the economic injustice, all into the same package, which is your soul, and try to survive it. And how do you make decisions that are moral and emotionally correct in relation to it? What do you teach your children?
Before we get to a bit more of that, I thought it'd be nice. I can't find a segue for this. But I thought, can you tell us about your childhood? You were born in New York.
I was born in New York, only because my mother and father. I mean, we could get really very specific here. My mother and father met in a bar in Rome after the war. Both Americans, waiting for other people, and left with each other. It appears I was conceived that evening. My childhood. I only found that out from my mother very recently. She's 95, and she told me, because I was checking into that very hotel, and in Italy to be a porter is a very big deal, so you keep the job forever. It's not considered a less position. I mean, it's very dignified to be the porter of a hotel. And I said, please give me a good room, and he said to me without even looking up, Signorina Jorie, I'm going to give you the room in which you were conceived. And I said, my childhood. So then my mother was pregnant, and she wanted to be with her mother for her firstborn, so she went back to the U.S. to introduce my father, not Jewish, to the Jewish family. And then after 3 months, they came back to Italy, and I was raised in Italy. But managed to make the really big mistake of not letting me get an EU passport or Italian passport at that point, so I was still stuck with just an American passport. Grew up in Rome, went to the French lycée, studied entirely through the French lycée system, and the French lycée system in those years was spectacular, and the lycée Chateaubriand was one of the best in the world. I was very lucky. I think extraordinarily formative for me was I was studying philosophy. You have to choose in the lycée system whether you want to major in, imagine, at the age of 10, this is the French, okay? Whether you want to major in philosophy, sciences naturelles, which is basically science, or literature. So I chose philosophy, which means you take that 5 days a week, and the other stuff you take 3 days a week. So the philosophy class was very important to me. And of course we had to do recitation of 100 lines of verse, first in Latin and then in French every morning. So, I mean, it was a great education. Made you crazy, but it was great. And I didn't really speak English, except in a sort of very broken manner, because a French au pair, everybody was Italian around me. I was living in Rome. My friends were Italian, going to the lycée. So, English was something my parents quarreled in, and they spoke to each other in private, and so that they thought that we couldn't quite understand, and we really couldn't. So one day my philosophy teacher became ill. I had to leave for a semester, and go figure. The only teacher they could find was Monsieur Chiglovsky, the geography teacher, to come in and fill in for the philosophy teacher. So it was fabulous because he tried to sort of teach philosophy as a kind of geography of the mind. And I recently met someone who's a very great environmentalist and found out we realized we had been at the lycée at the same time, and we were in the same class. We both said Mr. Chiglovsky's name at the same time. Very formative when someone would say, like, okay, we're going to discuss the sublime. Here are what the Alps look like. And then we really go into like chasms and heights and the age of these, or we're going to discuss, the ways in which reason and passion have to organize each other in relation to each other. So here's like the Rhine, and here's like the meadows. So it was a very interesting way to study philosophy for, and I think it was extremely formative. It put me into the body. Everything that was in the mind had to be run through the earth, and he had literally a metaphor that was literally about not nation states, not history. Thank God, not the history teacher. Okay? The geography teacher. So it felt like all concepts rose up out of the grass, and it was spectacular. And I knew I wasn't crazy in remembering this so vividly when my friend, who I hadn't seen in all these years, said, "Do you remember that amazing time when Mr. Chiglovsky took over the philosophy class?" And he became a prominent environmentalist. He's out there in Africa somewhere trying to save everybody, so I figured Mr. Chiglovsky was very formative. And my parents were, my mother's a sculptor, and she, worked in a studio and welded and worked in factories. And in all fairness, my mother it never occurred to her that she needed feminism, because she just was just so out there, like she was going to do whatever she wanted. Her parents' great dream for her was that she would go to bookkeeping school, and here she was making, enormous sculptures in factories, telling everyone what to do. So she was in heaven. And my father was a journalist, and we lived in Rome right after the war, during the period referred to as the Dolce Vita, and when the great Italian films were all being made, and Antonioni and Fellini. Rome was a very small town in those days. It's hard to imagine, but walking home in the evening after being out with your friends late at night, having snuck out of the house and gone out and, in the summer played in fountains and come back, you could hear, just as you do in the De Sica movies or whatever, you could hear one Vespa disappearing into the distance, quietly and endlessly, surrounded by silence, and then finally disappearing into the silence. And now when I go to Rome, I open the windows and it's just like, so that Rome is not the Rome I grew up in. And I worked in film, studied film, and when I went to college, I was going to work in film, and I was going to would have made films and would have probably become a film critic, because there were no women filmmakers when I went to film school and I went back to New York. It's a complicated story. How much do I have to talk about?
Well, I was going to take you forward to your poem Hiding Place, which is about the riots.
That's the part I'd skipped, yes.
Oh, sorry.
So in 1968, I left the lycée to go to the Sorbonne, because that's what you did if you went to a lycée. That was the free university that you went to. And I happened to be in the Nanterre campus at the time when there was a uprising that was actually started out as a student studying with Henri Lefebvre. There were 3,000 students in the class, and there were the sections had nothing to do with what your exams were. So we had some kind of a demonstration. But Daniel Cohn-Bendit was in my class, so he got kind of into it. Then became the Green Member of Parliament in Germany. And so then the events of 1968 happened. The government shut down. We were in the streets, and I learned a great deal about civil disobedience. It wasn't quite so civil, but we were arrested constantly. And then finally, the third time I was arrested, I had an American passport, so they threw me out of the country. So I had to come to the U.S. to school, which is really the only option. Otherwise, it meant going home and being with my parents in Rome, which didn't seem like a particularly good idea. And so I went to NYU. I had to apply. I had to go to any college that would take me in August, with no application. So I went to NYU, and Martin Scorsese and Haig Manoogian, a truly great teacher, were teaching at the NYU. In NYU, there was a great film studies program. There still is, but it's become more separate from the university than it used to be. And I studied cinematography and editing and filmmaking, but I also studied classics because I didn't have English yet, but I still had Latin. So I figured I could, through the universal image that's in film, I certainly knew a Bergman image from an Antonioni image from a Fellini image. I knew what images were in film, and I knew the universal vocabulary of the image, and I understood Latin. I figured I could figure it out in the U.S. And so I put that a bit together. Do I have to tell the rest of the story now?
Of course, when did poetry enter?
Okay, this story, I told it once, and then it ended up being retold so many times, so I feel silly. It's like quoting my Wikipedia page or something. But it is the case that I never did drugs. But one night somebody put hashish in the food we ate, and I didn't understand that, when you eat for quite a few days after that, you're out of your mind. And so I went to the NYU campus, and I got completely lost. And I remember the subway ride down there, not knowing what planet I was on. And then I got lost on the campus. I couldn't find where I was, and I was in a hallway. And this is really one of those miraculous moments of chance in life that one has to be open to. I mean, I devoted my life to being open to not just the everyday, but chance. Because I don't believe in chance. I just really believe that it's always there. There's always a fork in the road every day that one can be awake to if one tries to be. That involves the genuine paying of attention. In this case, I was paying attention to what sounds were around me, and I heard this booming voice coming out of a classroom in a building I'd never been in before, and it was M.L. Rosenthal, the great literary critic, who was doing that thing that professors do in late age, which is run out the clock on the classroom by reading aloud a vast amount of poetry. So in this case, he was reading Eliot. He was reading the love song of J.L. Prufrock, and I just heard this thing coming out of the door that was open, and I went and sat in the back seat of a large classroom and listened to, stoned out of my mind, the love song of J.L. Prufrock, and I thought, that sounds amazing. So I just started going back to auditing that class in the back room, and then he read Blake out loud, and he read Yeats out loud. I mean, just read everything out loud, and he read beautifully. And I sort of learned the English language by listening to him. And I fell in love with what would you do if someone was reading Yeats and Blake and Eliot to you and you didn't know. I mean, it was just a no-brainer. I was like, okay, moving over to this stuff. And so then I began writing horrible poems, trying to imitate, on the one hand, Yeats, and on the other hand, Sylvia Plath. You can imagine what a disaster that was. I had written poems in French. I had studied Rimbaud and Baudelaire and Mallarmé, and also Du Bellay, Ronsard, just a lot of French poetry, because obviously the French teach you a vast amount of literature in the lycée system. And I had tried to write really bad imitations of Rimbaud and Baudelaire and all that when I was younger. So I did find those notebooks one day. I'd forgotten that I'd done that. So.
Which was the poem where you found your voice, do you think? There was a particular... When did it go from those bad poems, as you put them, to something that you can stand by?
Okay. One day, I tried to write a poem about Pico della Mirandola. Don't ask me why, but it was a persona. I think I was reading Browning, and I was looking at persona poems, and I tried to write a persona poem. And then I wrote another persona poem in the voice of Masaccio if he had been a mortician. Just don't ask. But that was the title, Masaccio, if he had been a mortician. I mean, can you think of anything crazy? But I won an award. The poet, whom I really love, Alan Dugan, who was alive then, judged it and gave it a prize. And so I thought, the interesting thing about those poems is that I abandoned the attempt to be personal and subjective. I think by crossing through the persona poem, in which the accoutrements of what you do, where your voice can move, depend on what character you are sort of inhabiting, and what world. Masaccio's world comes with one thing, Pico della Mirando's world comes with another. So I think that objectivity was a very strong lesson. It allowed me to figure out that problem that one spends one life as a poet having, which is, what is the first person? It allowed me to sort of begin to sort of trammel that, sort of get it at the edges and try to figure out, who's speaking? I mean, it's not exactly me, and it's not me. It uses part of me. When you write a poem and then you revise it, you're a different you each time you revise it. So by the time you revised it 30 times, you're 30 times smarter than any one iteration of yourself, so who is that? And then, so it allowed me to get out. I think the Plath was a disaster because it was just like me, my imitation of Plath, my problems. So I got away from that pretty early on through. Then I decided to go to study it. Actually, another chance event. I'd been reading Yeats and studying Yeats on my own, really. And I was pregnant and married, and I had a miscarriage very far along, and then what seemed to be a pulmonary embolism, and I was in this ambulance all the way up to the hospital in Washington, D.C., and trying to figure out if I believed in Yeats's theory about the soul. Like I had to do that before, like, I, conked out. And so when I came to, I thought, you know what? The thing I was thinking about was Yeats, in extremis. That's what Yeats was my guide. So maybe I should go take this poetry thing seriously. So I applied to Columbia and went there, studied for a year there, and then went to Iowa and studied with Donald Justice. And once that you study with Donald Justice, whose idea is to say to you, if one poem, one line of verse is written in this workshop by anyone in this semester, one real line of verse, that will be a victory for everyone. One line. So he made the stakes so high, it was really, really exciting and thrilling. And then he introduced us to prosody and so.
I wanted to say a little bit about some of your things, and perhaps I haven't got as much time as I'd like, but the two things I wanted to bring out is this concern with history, that how I've been reading them is many of the poems feel like almost like thought experiments, like questioning the nature of being, but in the world of history. So the one that particularly, the Overlord, for instance. I thought you might say something about how history comes in, because a very strong theme in the work against or in contrast with the kind of pure mystery of being conscious and being embodied.
It's a beautifully put question. It would have been hard for me to avoid the sensation. First of all, it's not the idea of history, and it's not the facts of history, which are terrifying and oppressive, and which I did study. If one doesn't study it, one might live a life without knowing about it. But it is. I did grow up in the city of Rome, so I lived in a house that had an Etruscan well in it, and I was told that the things moving around in it were eels that the Etruscans and then the Romans put in the water, that lived there continuously for thousands of years, because they eat each other once they're done, and they keep the water clean, which is why the Romans would put so here were these Etruscan and Roman eels, in the basement of the house, and then the house was medieval fondi, and then the parts of it that you see immediately are where the late Middle Ages add these kinds of stones, and you can see that the stones are different, and then the Renaissance does this to the facade and changes everything on the outside, but the facade is a separate thing from the building. And then there's the 18th century, the piece of the facade that is the doorway is the 18th century, and there are the 18th century windows, and then a little bit of and how can you not sort of in your own dwelling understand that. I used to play a game when I was a child where I would imagine no one on these hills. I'm in Rome, like the hills of Rome. Nobody. Romulus and Remus, very important characters to me. The she-wolf. Like, then Ovid would kind of come in, and like, somehow the city would emerge. And then I'd imagine, you walk through the Roman Forum, and, if you're a child, I used to play in the Roman Forum as a child and get lost and fall in holes, and there would be, things. So, what is the Roman Forum? But except this place where the imagination of the past is kept alive. And so you walk out of the Roman Forum, in which the carvings and the very columns tell you, and then you know about Julius Caesar, and all these stories, and you walk out into the traffic of Via del Corso, and there's the balcony from which Mussolini spoke. So it's very hard not to say, well, my life has to be in relation to these things, because if you have Caesar on one end and Mussolini 5 minutes ago, and God help us, look where we are now, okay, then one is accountable to it. So but again, I would go back to the Keats. I was physically accountable to it. It was physically in my senses. The light, when it falls on the Foro Traiano in Rome at the end of the day, tells you that it's a light. You feel like that light's been falling on it for 3,000 years. It hasn't changed. So what the planet is, what the imagination of humans have done one of the stories that was most formative for me as a child, in order to understand, because when we were 15 years old, the Arno flooded, and all the schools in Rome and everywhere else, all the school children were sent up to Florence to help dig things out of the Arno, out of the mud. And so, there you are, and I remember pulling something that felt heavy, and then it came to the surface of the mud, and it was gilded, and it was a manuscript, and it was a medieval manuscript. It's very hard not to sort of feel you're living in history. And my favorite account of all that was this moment. And I don't remember, probably I read it in the Durant's history, which is probably irresponsible history. But anyway, I loved it as a child. It was the story of, there was a great drought in Rome, and people thought there was a person, the river had gone very low, and people thought there was a person waving out of the river, but then the waving just stayed intact, so somebody swam out to figure out what, and they dragged in a Hellenistic sculpture. They really hadn't, this is late Middle Ages, they'd never seen anything like this human body, this perfect form. And people, all over Italy were looking at one of these unbelievable, we were talking about Byzantine art, and then all of a sudden you're looking at this three-dimensional human with all the genitalia and everything else present, and with glorious arms and limbs with veins in them and feet and a face. And so the young Michelangelo Buonarroti is sent down by the masters he works for to draw it, to bring up a drawing of it. Like, what is this thing that they found? And there's the birth of Michelangelo, right there out of the river. So I always feel like it's a medium that we live in. That's why I say, how do I fit into this story as part of, I feel accountable to it. At this point, though, the story of history has become very different from the lovely narrative that one inherits as a child. It has destabilized itself, it has reorganized itself. What we thought was the Holocaust, that we thought would end all barbarism of that kind in the human soul, because we thought we were in the never again moment after having seen what the barbaric human soul could do in one of the most civilized countries, with their great music and architecture. We suddenly, find ourselves with 5 subsequent genocides in the space of 2 decades. So, and then all of a sudden the earth itself is in question, and you feel like the Anthropocene is a very different kind of history than just the history that you were sort of the wonderful narratives of what you've, and it gets revised, and the history of who wrote the history comes into question, and then the history of who's in control of the rewriting of the history. Each of us in our own silos is rewriting history and privileging those aspects of it that we think serve our cause the best. So then history's become super malleable, and then physics and science come in to blow it all apart and tell us that the agricultural revolution was probably the single stupidest thing we ever did, and so we tend to agree. So then we get really confused, and we look back at hunter-gatherers and we think they were probably the single. And look at what happened to the Neanderthals. The very term has changed its nature. The Neanderthals have become probably the most brilliant artists of the past. Turns out they probably so it's a malleable thing, and it's an exciting thing, but it's also at this point, morally, I just don't know as an artist what I'm supposed to do if I were to sort of turn my back on it. And it has so many different meanings, the word history, that we all know we're talking about something different.
But then in the other theme I want you to bring out in the poems is this religious sense. There's your poem at the Cabaret Now finishes with, "Why did we live, Lord? Blood in the wind. Why were we meant to live?" And then there are all the, in Overlord there are these attempts at prayer, and there's this strong sense of, in your work, yearning for a sort of transcendence, looking to try to pray, and I wonder whether you could say something about the religious sense in your work. I'm not sure any longer that I know anything. Anything. Everything I thought I knew, and all the stakes I put in the ground in my life to make sense of things that obviously evolved and changed in nature. They're dissolving at a rate of speed, and what I thought humans were changed. What I thought humans' custodial relationship to the planet might be instinctively vanished. What I came to feel and need to call creation, which I never thought I would have to call it, but it's attached to a certain religious tradition, but
the astonishing mystery of what we're destroying was actually became louder and more essential to my life as I began to understand what we had unleashed. So, if anything, I'm an animist. I mean, I believe in the intelligence. Science helps me in this. I believe the acute intelligence of forests and trees. I believe in that. I mean, I used to pray to different things. I pray that I pray to undo us. I pray to stop it. I mean, I would like to unhuman us. I'm not comfortable with the species I belong to, and I would prefer that other species survive over ours. So that is not something that I started out when I was a young person believing. But we all have these moral questions now. If you have to trade in, all of the elephants and all of the Uffizi, I'm just like the elephants for sure. But I grew up in a world where making art, was something that was really essential. So now making one's soul be a human soul that you can sort of carry to the end with a sense of perhaps not having done too much damage seems to me an incredibly compelling reason for living, but also extremely difficult. It seems that one does damage all the time, at second, third, or fourth remove from whatever one thinks one has done that causes no damage. So, yes, I would like to have moments of peace, and I've just live in the moment, and I do try very hard to sit in that chair and feel my weight. And I was walking through St. James's Park, and there was, in the middle of everything going on, there was this nightingale singing. And I've spent 3 days just trying to remind myself all the time about, just the feeling and sound of this bird. Because the nightingale is the one bird that never repeats its song. It's constantly inventing its song. It's the only one like that. So it's a really thrilling, incredible creature. And so if I could pray, it would be like that nightingale. That's what I would just like to just be grateful. Gratitude comes freighted with like 60 different obligations that are social, cultural, and economic. I mean, we're in a very acutely technologically noisy and noisy with over self-consciousness place. So I think meditation is closer to prayer now than prayer. When I was younger, I thought I could still pray because I thought there was a chance. I have to be honest. I mean, I don't know what kind of a chance there is now, so I just try to do no harm, and that's a form of prayer.
And moving to a close, but can poetry help? Does poetry help?
Well, it helps me. If people want to open themselves to poetry, I'm sure poetry helps. But poetry is a practice like meditation, so that if you want to open yourself to, there are a number of voices that will speak to us in our condition, and they're called Emily Dickinson and John Keats and Gerald Manley Hopkins and Donne, and they're all out there. But to open oneself to poetry really does mean deciding that one is going to just read Dickinson start to finish. Don't read any critics. Don't read about it. Just read her, and by the end of reading her, you speak Dickinson. It's a strange language. You can't pick up Emily Dickinson without thinking, man, this is really difficult if you don't know it. And then letting difficulty get in your way. It's like sort of listening to French and thinking, boy, that's strange. That's really difficult if you don't speak French. Okay? But if you read Dickinson, then you speak Dickinson. If you read Gerald Manley Hopkins, who might seem difficult, just read him start to finish a few times. Don't have to worry about what it means. Just read him. You will then speak Hopkins. And can they help? Yes, but not for everybody. I do believe that if more people trusted what this art form has done for millennia after millennium, and if more people knew that their language and the souls that had used their language had undergone the very crises that they're undergoing, and that the answers are all there, I think everyone would be turning to it. But it's not taught in the schools. Very few people read it, and most people are just interested in writing it. And so there's a very big difference between reading it and writing it. And although you have to read it to write it, the feeling of, I don't like the fact that in most classes in schools, the way to entice children to be interested in poetry is by telling them they should write their own poems. I feel like, screw that. They should read the poems. They don't have to constantly have their ego like, oh, your lovely little poem, Johnny. Well, no. How about reading some Yeats here? It would really help with some Blake. And I feel that that's, the fact that most people turn to poetry now because they all want to write it's fine. I think it's great. But I also believe that you can turn to it the way you open up a prayer book in any religion. It's all there. It's just so available. It's for free. You don't have to have, any library has it all. You can just go in and sit with it, and your soul can be restored to you. It's it's like that nightingale. It's what it is. But it has to do with being comfortable with not knowing. You have to sit with the poem and you read it, and it doesn't tell you what it means. Certainly a good one, it doesn't tell you. It just tells you do this for a while, and then do this for a while. And after a while, you're doing it. And then your soul is doing it. But if you go after it, as Keats says, what you want to read it with is negative capability without irritable reaching after fact and reason. If you're got some teacher saying to you, what does this poet mean by this? Well, first of all, the poet couldn't answer that question. Poet doesn't know. And you don't know because there is no answer. But if you just go to it like the sound and the music, and it's there, and just memorize it, recite it, walk around with it. Nothing like a poem inside you walking around in the day saying it. And try a poem every couple of days just to memorize it. You don't have to understand it, just inhabit it, and it will do wonders. It's not just a seduction tool, which I think is the primary use of poetry.
That's a great place to finish. Thank you very much.